The Limud Toronto Festival takes place on Sunday, November 21st. Limud features educators, performers, authors, activists, and innovators from around the world. The Limud Festival of Jewish Learning celebrates creativity, diversity, inclusivity, and discussion. Everyone is welcome. All tickets to Limud are pay what you can. Learn more at limud.ca.
This is Bonjour Chai, the Circumspect about Circumcision edition. I'm Avi Feingold in Montreal, and I'm here with Lana Zakon in Montreal, and David Sklar in Calgary. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we will be talking with Eliyahu Ungar-Sargon of Bruchim about Jews who are choosing not to circumcise their children, and we continue our book club with a charming work by Rick Salutin and his son, Gideon. But first, how are you guys? How's your week been?
Good. I'm just always here. I think since I labeled my column The Jewish Nomad, my life has become more nomadic. It's like I put it out into the ether that that's what I want, and suddenly I keep having all these gigs that are bringing me to Montreal every month.
Are you allowed to talk about the gig?
Yeah. I do a lot of commercials, radio ads. Mm-hmm. So I did a radio ad for National Bank that should be coming out in about a week. Mm-hmm. So that's why I came in. And once I was coming in, I decided to come in for the week and see my family and come do this live with Avi.
Awesome.
Isn't that very typical of all the actors who end up moving from Montreal to Toronto? As soon as they do and set up their 100%. New place, they get jobs all back in Montreal.
I know.
Yeah. Well, today, though, is Remembrance Day, which is a much bigger deal here in Canada than it is in other countries. It's Veterans Day in the U.S., and they don't make that as big a deal about it. Do you guys, what do you guys think about when you think about November 11th, the 11th hour, the 11th day? David, you got anything?
You know what, to be honest, usually it's quite disconnected, obviously, from my day-to-day life. That being said, though, I also work as a recreational therapy aid worker. So I was at a seniors residence this past week on one of the COVID units. And there are quite several veterans who are there. So it was really nice to talk to them. They were doing events for Remembrance Day this week as well. So it was really nice just to spend time with them, listen to their stories as they were being asked. Family was coming in. It was a really nice, very personal experience for me to really hear it directly from veterans' mouths.
Yeah. I've always had an affinity for it. I always liked the poppy. I remember in the States where the poppy was never available. I would always save one. I would save one from year to year to year. No, it's a Canadian thing.
Okay. Right.
In Flanders Field, the poppies grow between the crosses, row on row. You didn't have to memorize that, no?
I've heard it in school. We said it. I didn't memorize it.
It's a good poem. It's a beautiful moment. It's World War I, Vimy Ridge, all this stuff. You know, it was always a great marker of Canadians, like finding other Canadians in the States when like November would roll around and you'd pull out your saved poppy that you have as a relic, like in a box.
But here's my beef with the poppy. But it always falls off. Mm-hmm. You cannot go more than 2 days until it falls off. And is that a marketing thing where they want to make sure?
With it.
Absolutely. I want a poppy that stays on for at least 2 weeks.
Listen, there are poppies staying on hacks, and I don't want to get into them right now because beyond the scope of this discussion, but we can talk offline about some good hacks for keeping your poppy on. But it's a moment, and I think it's actually it's a profoundly Jewish moment when we remember those who have lost, and we honor those who came back and those who served, right? And I love the fact that many congregations do something in the Shabbat leading up to it. And many Jewish veterans, there are fewer and fewer Jewish veterans these days because there are fewer Jews that currently serve in the armed forces, and the Jews that served when they were drafted in World War II in Canada are getting older, and they're not as around as they used to be. But those that are here, it's a beautiful day and to honor them and to salute them and to remember the sacrifice that their brethren gave, so that we can record podcasts. When Rick Salutin's son asked him where his name came from, the famed Canadian author, playwright, and journalist responded, "The Bible." His name is Gideon, of course. What's the Bible, was the son's natural response. And this led to years of conversations about the stories in the Bible, Rick's relationship to the book, and to the faith he grew up in. These conversations are now collected in a rollicking and charmingly illustrated book called, appropriately, Gideon's Bible. A father and son discuss God, the Bible, and life, and it is out on ECW Press. What did you guys make of this book?
Well, first off, I have to say that the cartoons were brilliant. They were so beautifully drawn, and I loved how at the beginning he talks about being younger and studying Torah and Talmud and how he loved the commentary all the way around. And then quickly I noticed that was the way that they styled the book. And they have these cartoons, like a comic strip, almost going around as if that's like the Rashi or the commentary. And I thought that was really, really brilliantly done.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was so fun to read. I got through with it in one day. And it was so nice to revisit a lot of these stories from Genesis that I had forgotten and to sort of start to see the connection between each story. It was the first time I saw how each story has this through line almost about father and son and relationships to God. It was very inspiring.
It also pushed a lot of boundaries. Like I was trying to describe the book to someone and they were like, oh, is it a kid's book? And I was like, no, but I guess you could read it with your kids. But they talk about a lot of things that some Jewish parents might not feel comfortable having their kids read. What did you take?
So look,
yeah,
I've seen many authors. It's a familiar trope in publishing to do a rereading of the Bible. I've seen some that are new, some that are older. There's somebody that's doing one right now as a Substack that's really fascinating. And, for many of these rereadings, they fail. They really fall flat. And it's, I think, because there's a lack of self-awareness of the prejudice that they bring to their reading. How the violence they do to the text often, right? It's not always, but they often do a lot of violence, like really,
right.
The rereading is like so extreme and reshaping, and that it isn't able to be borne by the text itself. The text can't support the weight of the rereading that they're attempting to do. Now, the Bible itself has lasted so long simply because it can, and it does have the ability to be read in so many ways. Not all of them are right. And what I love is that your right and my right reading of the Bible are different, and that's a feature and not a bug. What I found remarkable in this case about this book is that you have a father who has that really great self-awareness, right, about the prejudice he brings to the book, and a son who is completely naive and in the best way possible. And they meet in the middle, and the conversations that they're having are so much the better for it. And that's what I found so inspiring and so interesting about the book, was that you see this really jaded conversation, you see this fresh take, and the fresh take is really not because we're protecting our kid and this kid doesn't have
he's
ideas
very
in
honest.
the Bible. He's really honest about it. And the questions he gets to ask are not pointed, well, the Bible sucks because of this. It's just, this seems weird to our sensibility questions. Because I don't know what the Bible means and what it represents as a result of that.
Yeah. I don't know if this is going too broad, but what did you make of the way that God was personified in this book? And I can be more specific.
Go ahead.
Please do.
Went way too broad. Well, I'll just go with my opinion first, and then I would love to hear yours. But God was personified with gendered pronouns, which does happen a lot. And so God was referred to as he, and almost personified in a way that made it feel unaligned with my view of how I see God in Judaism, as more of a force of creation, as opposed to this deity who's all powerful, which brings up a whole other slew of debate and conversation. But it felt like if a non-Jew picked up this book, I think they would have a very different idea of what God means to Jews than the one that I do. So it in some way it was subjective to the writer's perception of God, coming from these two different perspectives. And I was wondering if that was something you picked up on or not.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like the God of the Genesis stories is a particular type of unique God. And they discuss how God changes, right, throughout the Bible itself. So they sort of say, either this is a God that interferes a lot with human destiny and choices. So I wonder if it would evolve if there was a continuation of it with God in further books. This feels like a God that is really controlling destiny and then pulling it a bit away. It's interesting. I didn't pick up so much on God being male in this version, but it was very clear how women were.
Well, it says he many times, which it happens in a lot of translations. And then there's usually at the beginning of a Tanakh, there'll be a little note that's we use he pronouns, but really God is not a person and it's not really pronoun. And I don't know.
So the problem is, this is a translation problem.
100% it's a translation
God
problem.
is gendered in the Bible.
In many different ways, though, and that's why isn't that the case?
No, but I'm saying the word God,
yes,
right, is
gendered,
is
right?
done in
Because
the
that's
masculine,
how Hebrew
right?
is written.
Yeah, and everything is gendered in the Bible, and
right.
that's we can get into that whole discussion about how do we degender Hebrew, and there's a whole movement around that.
Yeah.
But when you are translating the Bible, right, you end up using a lot of gendered language for God, and one can either choose to be, again, violently awkward and remove that gendered language, and that just takes it away, or acknowledge that there's a lot of stuff, right? Maimonides talks about how God doesn't have a hand, right? And God doesn't get angry.
Yeah,
and yet
exactly.
and all of this is there. And so I think when you translate, I don't have a problem with saying in a translation of the Bible itself to say he or whatever in that way. But when talking about God as in a conversational way, to say God self, right, would be a little more, or to say just keep referring to God might be a little more appropriate. I think in this case, it didn't affect me nearly as much as that, because it was more about the translation issue, and in that sense, because a big chunk of the book is just translations of the book of stories of Genesis. And they clearly deliberately leave it at the end of Genesis, and they are, and I hope that there are more volumes forthcoming. Apparently, Gideon is a student at McGill, and
oh really?
Yeah, so we could have had him on. Now that we're doing everything, I found the critique that I had, and I'm curious your thoughts about what you thought about this, was that the illustrations really are great.
Yeah.
The Talmudic style of layout is really nice. It's a nice touch. It's not really a graphic novel per se.
Not 100%.
In my mind. I mean, and again, there's a lot of you read Scott McCloud about what comics are and what comics aren't, and you can get into graphic novel theory. One can say that the commentary is in a graphic novel style because it is narrative, illustrated, and it progresses and things like that. I found that it didn't always work in that style. And I was wondering how else this material could have been presented.
In what ways did you find it didn't work?
I just found like the back and forth bubbles. Just If most of the drawings are the father and the son back forth bubble, talking to each other, like maybe, I mean, he's a playwright. Maybe this could have been a really cool stage play. Maybe this could have been a podcast series. I mean, of course, they hadn't recorded their conversations as they were happening. This feels like this was, reminiscing of conversations that they've had years after the fact or whatnot. But I was curious, and I love the illustrations. It's beautiful. I'm a big fan of putting things together. Many graphic novel attempts have been made with books of the Bible, with Jewish works. And I'm going to definitely add this in there as something that I appreciate and I will pull out to teach and do stuff with. I was just curious how else the material could have been presented, and it may have been more effective in some interesting way or not. I don't know if you thought about it.
No, I felt it quite very effective. It was a really easy, enjoyable read, especially with the Midrash commentary, all in these bubble thoughts that I could follow their relationship throughout at the same time as the story of Genesis was building. And I saw their arguments back and forth. I actually felt this was a wonderful way of doing the story of Genesis.
Like I said, I didn't think it was bad. I was curious about the
medium.
Yeah, and if I was questioning the medium, then maybe it wasn't so nearly as immersive in that sense. And
I don't know if it would work in those other mediums that you described. I think the fact that it is a book with the pictures around, because then you kind of have a choice. It's almost like there's two stories going on in the book. You can either read the middle part, which is just the story of Bereshit, or you could just read the comics, which is the story of the father and the son. And I think it's an interesting way to engage people, especially in an era where, I don't have stats on this, but I would imagine that people of a younger generation are maybe reading a little bit less than they used to. And when you have a book with pictures, it might entice people to read more.
What I really found interesting was I saw Judaism sort of as this upstart movement, as they described in it itself, right? I sometimes think about our religion and Judaism is very old, very antiquated, but they sort of said this Judaism was a rebellion. It was an attack against old world rules. And that was really exciting to sort of see where this upstart religion comes in and starts trying to make its way in the world with all these other more ancient religions. It was what did they say? They said it was good to undermine old rules, which I felt is what the book was doing.
Well, I thought that that was really borne out because of the fact that Gideon is reading this in a very new light. And that's part of that new reading, because we can often think about this book as like the 3,000 years of history that we put onto it. And we often just sit there and think about it with all the commentaries and all the ideas that were thrown onto it previously. And this new reading, this fresh reading, reminds us of that very point, which I think is a great point. And to your point, Alana, I think that anything that we can do to get more people reading and more people reading Jewish books is a great thing. And so, yes, I highly applaud it. And I liked it. I'm giving it a thumbs up. You too?
Yeah, I'm giving it a thumbs up.
David's giving it a thumbs up.
I wanted to bring up that in the spirit of Jewish Book Month and our Bonjour Chai book club, BCBC, I went to the Giller Prize Gala the other day and actually had a chance to talk to Margaret Atwood, who wrote the foreword, coincidentally, of Gideon's Bible. And we're going to play a little clip for you of my conversation with her.
Hi, I'm Ilana from the Canadian Jewish News. We're actually covering Rick Salutin's Gideon's Bible this week. And I just read your foreword today, and I was wondering, do you have a favorite Bible passage?
So I'll recommend a book to you, which is a great book. It's called God, a Biography. And it's just old, and it takes the view. God is a character in a book.
Ooh, I like that.
God is a character in the book. How do we know about characters in books? We know about characters in books because of what they say, what they do, what other people say about them, and how their actions affect other people. So he takes that view and he goes through book by book. Mm-hmm. He's got the best thing on the book of Job that I have ever read.
Wow.
So why don't we stick with the book of Job, a problematic book.
Fair enough.
So once upon a time, as you probably know, and that's how I know Rick, I was at Camp White Pine where Sun will always shine. And also at that camp was a proto-rabbi, being a rabbi, from New York, who had never been outside New York City and was in hell in Halliburton, Canada.
Wow.
So we became friends because I helped him out with his problems involving this place is driving me crazy. And he taught me swearing in 2 languages.
Oh,
Hebrew and Yiddish.
Hebrew and Yiddish. Do you remember any of the swears?
Oh, yes, I do, but I'm not going to tell them to you. So then, many years later, I was at the Smithsonian Institute, and this man comes up in the line to get his book signed, and he says, I am Gus Buchdahl. And I say, Gus. And he says, honey. So then we go out for a drink afterwards, and I say, tell me about the book of Job. And he says the following classic lines. It says, the authorities are agreed. God does not come out of this with clean hands.
I like it. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Take care.
Excellent. That was wonderful. We'd love to hear what you think about the book. If you've read it and if you haven't, but you want to, here is your chance. We have a copy to give away, and all you have to do is email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca, and we will pick one listener at random and send you a brand new copy of the book. You can read it. You can give it away. You can read it and then give it away, because I know we all do that at some point, right? Just email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca to enter, and we will give away a copy of this book to anybody, not to everybody, but to one person from the people who email us. And that is Gideon's Bible, A Father and a Son Discuss God, the Bible, and Life by Rick Salutin and Gideon Salutin. David.
Hi.
Now you know about watches.
I'm learning.
We're going to up your level, right? You got a basic watch now. What else can you do with a watch, right? You can have a more, it can tell the time
with it.
As we spoke about the basics of mechanical watches and being automatic, you can move up a level and find a more beautiful case for it, a more beautiful face for it. That's where a mechanical watch becomes a piece of art sometimes, is when the art of the inside is not reflected exactly, right? And we see exactly that, but we see some interesting face, some interesting bracelet, some interesting dial show itself off and show off and represent itself as a beautiful watch, as a beautiful item that we can see on its own. So Seiko actually takes that to the next level and often really does beautiful finishes for a lot of their watches. And that's where you can take your watch buying from a Seiko 5 to a Seiko Presage, or a Seiko with a beautiful porcelain like finished dial, or one with like a nice engraving on the top that they really care about and is hand finished. And that's where you're going to start spending a little bit more money from a basic watch to the next level watch, is being able to think about how you can move your watches up. What kind of watch would you say to yourself, like, oh, I like the shape of that, or I like the color of that?
I'd like a watch that's sort of a reflection of my personality, where it's not too over the top, not too many bells and whistles on it, but really just gets me through the day.
And that's the kind of thing that you would tell somebody at Atelier Lou when you pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, I'd like a new watch. And they will guide you towards several amazing options.
That's true. And if you are listening to our show, you can use the code BON18 at checkout for 10% off your order at atelierlou.com.
So Atelier Lou, always been a great sponsor of the show. That is how they think they will try to find you the right watch for your personality, and not just to sell you the best thing that they can or the most expensive thing that they can. So go to atelierlou.com and get your watch fix going. The first time I came across the idea of intactivism in general and within the Jewish community was in 2011 when Eliyahu Ungar-Sargon, a friend and neighbor of mine when we were both living in Chicago, released his film entitled Cut, Slicing Through the Myths of Circumcision. Eli is a founding member of the board of Bruchim, an organization devoted to fostering welcoming spaces within the Jewish community for Jews who are not circumcised. Eli is still a good friend, even though we don't speak as often as we'd like, and he is now a filmmaker in Los Angeles, where he joins us from today. Eli, welcome to Bonjour Chai.
Thank you, Avi. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So let's start. In the wake of the recent article by Gary Shteyngart in the New Yorker about his own botched circumcision and his resulting position against circumcision, a new wave of articles and social media posts about Brit Milah in the Jewish community has surfaced, and Bruchim has had its launch, wading right into the debate. First of all, what I want to know is, was it merely serendipity that you chose to launch at this moment, or did you take the opportunity presented and run with it? And what can you broadly tell us about the state of Jewish intactivism in 2021?
Yeah, so it was absolutely serendipitous that Shteyngart's article came out around the same time that we were planning to launch our website. And that was just good fortune for our organization. What can I tell you about the state of Jewish intactivism in 2021? Well, I can tell you that Bruchim is a very exciting new organization that is seeking to sort of bring... and for your audience, intactivist, it's a kind of portmanteau between intact and activism. And so intactivists are what you may have known as anti-circumcision activists in the past. It's kind of a rebranding that was done to sort of be more positive sounding.
Right, yeah, I saw that on the website using the word intact. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, so the Bruchim is really a kind of new organization. We're very much not anti-circumcision. That's sort of explicitly not part of our mission. We're trying to advocate for Jews who have made the decision already not to circumcise their children to be more accepted and welcomed into Jewish spaces. That's our mission. And that's our approach. Yeah, over the pandemic, we started meeting virtually. We had monthly Zoom meetings that sort of were growing over time. And that's who we are, and that's what we do right now.
Well, I was just curious about the journey sort of that led you to founding Bruchim in the first place.
Yeah, it's Avi mentioned that back in, I think he said 2011. That was when I went on tour with my film, and I actually finished making it in 2007. So this is a long time ago now, and I'm dating myself a bit. But I made a film called Cut, Slicing Through the Myths of Circumcision. It was a feature-length documentary about infant male circumcision and Jewish identity. I was just coming out of art school, and I had spent 3 years in medical school also, so it felt like a natural topic, and it was always something that I was super interested in. Circumcision to me is a really interesting example that forces what to me seems like an obvious conflict between secular humanist ethics and the Jewish tradition. And I find subjects like that endlessly fascinating. And so I made a film about circumcision and Jewish identity. And I took it all over North America, and it's now traveled all over the world, and it's taught in some academic settings also. And so as I went around with my film and started these conversations, I networked with a lot of people, and you get to know all of the Jews involved. And fast forward to the pandemic, and we all felt that it was time to really take a different approach. Instead of having a conversation about the ethics of circumcision, which is what most of us had been doing for a very, very long time, we thought it would be more interesting and more valuable to the Jewish community to start talking about inclusion of Jews who have made this decision. And that was kind of the genesis of Bruchim.
Right. Since you launched Bruchim, have you received any pushback from the community at large?
So it's a great question, and we're very new. We've only been on the scene. Our website, I should say, has only been on the scene now for, I think, about a month. Avi mentioned that the Shteyngart article came out around the same time, so there's kind of a conversation happening organically about this subject. And I have to say that we haven't experienced a ton of pushback just yet. I think things are new, so, give it time kind of thing. I'm sure it'll come. But I also think that this approach of talking about this from a perspective of inclusion means that some of the normal pushback that we might expect, that I've experienced, for well over a decade now having conversations about this, I think it's going to be a little different because we're trying to have a different conversation.
I mean, in some way, what you're doing is what the successful movement towards acceptance of interfaith families has been doing, which is stop focusing on the halacha around the actual marriage and whether that's an acceptable thing, and say, look, once this has happened, we should be including these people in our communities regardless. And in some way, that after the fact sort of thing is noble, but in some, let's be honest, there's no movement of Bruchim unless you have people who are consciously making that decision to say, I'm not circumcising my children.
That's right. And I think that's where the pushback's going to come from, right? Once we get through the layers that we're talking about, some people are going to feel threatened by what we're doing. Some people are going to see it as normalizing something that they don't want normalized. But when I think about inclusion, Avi, I think about it in two directions. Obviously, there's the need that we're serving for these families who feel alienated from the Jewish community. And, there's a growing number of those. And we can talk about that if you'd like. But I just want to bring attention to it from the other direction, too. I come from an Orthodox background, and sometimes I kind of marvel at the exclusion of women from Torah spaces. And I think to myself, you think that you're sort of being super progressive as an Orthodox person by allowing a few women to have a little place where they could study Talmud. And what I hear is you think you can afford to not have 50% of your population studying Torah? Like, that to me is the direction that doesn't get represented enough. And I feel the same way about this, that you think you can afford to alienate Eliyahu Ungar-Sargons from your communities. You can't. We're on an all hands on deck kind of situation. The world is melting down in multiple ways. We have massive crises going on now. We can't afford to exclude these people.
Yeah. Something that I thought was really interesting that I read on the website was the whole concept of don't ask, don't tell, because it is something that comes up a lot, right? Don't ask, don't tell if someone's driving to shul on Shabbat. And so on the website, it sounds like you're making a commitment to have those families be immediately included. How do you actually go about doing that so that they walk in knowing that they do feel safe and they don't have to be hush-hush about it?
Yeah, I mean, don't ask, don't tell is one of those things that I can't think of an example where it actually works, right? Like, we can think about other kinds of contexts where don't ask, don't tell has been attempted, and it never really works because, and with circumcision, there's such a taboo around the subject anyway that it kind of lends itself to a don't ask, don't tell policy. But what that ends up doing is you end up with situations where children are body shamed or parents are shamed for making this decision and end up feeling alienated. And so our vision at Bruchim around this is we have what we call a concierge service. And what we eventually want to do is be able to provide parents who have made this decision with a list, a master list of communities, camps, schools that have come on board with our mission so that those parents can know and those families can know that they don't have to engage with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They don't have to worry about a diaper change at a daycare or something like that. That actually we have a kind of, a list, a master list of all of the places that are openly willing to be welcoming of them as full members of the Jewish community.
I mean, Don't Ask, Don't Tell has worked for circumcision for probably 2,000 years. Nobody checks the circumcision. People just assume. And in that sense, like, that's where I think the reticence is coming from, where this, like, people, don't necessarily want to talk about it, because it's just like, why do I have to talk about it if it's there already? If I just assume that every male person walking to the synagogue already has a Brit Milah, what happens when a plurality of people no longer have a Brit Milah? That's when the Don't Ask, Don't Tell becomes untenable, and that's when it becomes uncomfortable. And that's where I think the pushback comes, because there are going to be congregations that are going to want to say, right, halachically it may be acceptable to give this person an aliyah or a bar mitzvah or whatnot, but we don't want to for larger social grounds. And then you might see a schism. And that's what I'm curious if you guys thought about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's sort of, just a quick correction from my perspective. I think there are places that you say people don't check and places don't check, but one of the things that we do at our monthly meeting is we have people tell stories, and I've heard a lot. Again, this is at this stage anecdotes, right? And part of Bruchim's mission is actually to do some social research and provide actual numbers on this subject, because, let's face it, like, no one actually knows how many Jews are opting out, how many Jews are opting in, how many Jews are doing it in the hospital versus having it done by, like, these are all questions that we want answered. And part of our one of our midterm goals is actually to start providing that information, because I think it's super interesting. But I can tell you anecdotally that there are parents, and this, it's fascinating to me that it tends not to happen as much in the Orthodox world. This might be a self-limiting issue, but we do hear stories from the conservative, capital C conservative Jewish communities, where they are kind of checking and sometimes acting punitively. And there's a long history of this in sort of Jewish responsa and halachic decision-making about, can this issue be used as a sort of a wedge, a fulcrum to try and press on other Jewish identity issues. But the sad truth is, I know people personally who have made this decision, and then 12 years, 13, 14 years later, so they made this decision not to circumcise their son, and then they want to have their daughter bat mitzvahed in a conservative synagogue, and the rabbi makes a public example out of them for not having done something 12 years ago that has nothing to do with the daughter, but we won't let this girl be bat mitzvahed in our synagogue. And that happens more than you might think.
That almost feels like they're shaming. It feels like they're shaming the family then for a decision that was made a long time ago.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and I'm curious, because it just feels like circumcision is such a ritual or a tenet of Judaism that if you're going to do anything at all, you can ignore the Sabbath, you can not keep kosher, but if you're going to do the bare minimum, it feels like circumcision is that thing. It feels like a very tenuous feels like a big struggle that a lot of future generations are going to have. When we were meeting, I was thinking, okay, if I have a son, what would I do in the future? And I think I have a lot of questions about moving ahead with circumcision. It feels like this is like a real big struggle right now within the Jewish community.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because I think a lot of people have that reaction to this rite. They feel like it's something that's core, and it's like a really important part of the Jewish tradition. Of course, any familiarity with the Jewish tradition will tell you that we've got 2 Jews and 3 opinions. And circumcision is no exception to that. So there are parts of the Jewish tradition in which circumcision is really important, right? So like the mystical and Hasidic sides of the tradition, they put an enormous amount of emphasis on circumcision as like a huge mitzvah. And of course, there are plenty of Talmudic sources and Midrashic sources that sort of sing the praises of circumcision and talk about how important it is. But if you think about the rationalist side of the tradition, so Maimonides, for example, For him, it's another commandment. It's another mitzvah. And I often think back to, we had our world premiere of my film at the University of Chicago's Hillel. And Rabbi Asher Lopatin was one of the panel members on the Q&A. And, he saw the film and we were having this discussion and he said, okay, so maybe if you're getting into Judaism, maybe make Shabbat, your mitzvah, not circumcision. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. And I thought that was great. And it's also apt, of course, because Shabbat is also described as a covenant in the Torah. But more to the substance of your point, I think there's a sense, if we get beyond the kind of nerdy, Talmudic, and halachic discussion, there's a kind of anthropological sense around circumcision in the Jewish community, that this is tied to Jewish identity. And that's a real thing. And I think it's not unique to the Jewish community too. Like I'm familiar with cutting practices all over the world. And there's something about, making a body modification that really does, it's a very sticky identity marker. And across multiple cultures, we see this.
But
so
the way
that's a real thing.
You were
and
talking,
it's not particularly religious.
You were talking about this as a feminist thing, right? Where you're
I was
talking about
just
women in
thinking
Torah.
about that.
And
Yeah.
it's something that I think about a lot, that the discussions around Brit Milah do not include women. And this idea that this is an identity marker for Jews, often forgets to add that it's an identity marker for Jewish males or Jewish male identified individuals, or however you want to define that. And there's something that leaves women out of the discussion in a huge way, that Brit Milah in and of itself, with the discussion around it, can and should be discussed or should be rethought, cast that with that light in mind.
Yeah, I read something
absolutely.
about that yesterday too. And I was reading, I hadn't heard about these other alternatives like the Brit Shalom or the people cutting open a pomegranate. Like I was reading up on a bunch of different situations. And it's interesting because now that I'm thinking about it, if I had some kind of body mutilation, like now it's making me think about, would I want to do that to my daughter? Whereas like I have it in my head that I'm like, oh yeah, I'm for sure going to give my son a bris if I have a son. But it's funny how like that doesn't seem to apply when I think about it for myself. I just like an interesting thought experiment.
No, that's fascinating and important. And that's a great little thought process you had there. I think maybe one of these days. Yeah, no. So going back for a second to the conversation we were having about the different parts of the Jewish tradition and which part emphasizes circumcision more versus which part emphasizes it less, right? If you think about it, not to put too fine a point on this, but the more emphasis you place on circumcision, the less important women become, right? Because they don't do it. So the more important circumcision is from your kind of Jewish Weltanschauung, from your Jewish worldview, the less important women are in your Jewish worldview. It's just, there's no way around that, right?
I don't know. I think that in the conservative movement, Brit Milah is still a very fundamental concept, and yet it's about as egalitarian as it can get without actually circumcising women in the conservative movement. But I'm saying everything else is open to women, and that to me is where I see the big pushback, as you said, is within the halachic movements. You don't have any halachic rabbis within your rabbinic advisory board at Bruchim. What I found fascinating preparing for this is that I couldn't find, and I didn't do a huge exhaustive search, but there was a lot of rabbis from the liberal and traditional and the halachic and non-halachic denominations that were willing to give me information on background, but weren't willing to come and talk about this in public. And I think that says something really interesting. I think that the halachic movements are going to have to grapple with this at some point and contend with it. I personally think that they're going to come out on the right side of this and say that there might be reason to exclude in some way or another people that aren't that do not have a Brit Milah. But that being said, I think that I personally am in this this weird middle ground where I do like to include as many people as possible. I do think that halachic ceremonies like this and rituals are in some ways in which we work on the particularistic versus the universal. And I'm wondering where the particularistic forms of Judaism are, that when we take some of the things that are so basic and we universalize them and say, well, this doesn't have to be part of Judaism. Well, then what are the things that have to be part of Judaism as a result of that? right? Once we take big pieces, and I'm sure this is not a new question, but right, and I'm not equating not circumcising to like apostasy and Christianity and stuff like that. I'm not making that moral equivalence at all, but there are clearly lines that we make as particularistic Jews, and crossing this one seems to be one step too far for a lot of rabbis, even though they don't want to talk about it, and that in and of itself is worthy of another discussion.
So first of all, Avi, you're welcome to join our Rabbinical Advisory Council and become the first halachic rabbi on our RAC. That would be wonderful.
Only if I agreed with the position, which again, I'm not entirely sure that I agree with completely.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, because I was grappling with all of this myself, and I've had many times in my life where I have had to have the hard conversation because of relationships I've been in with people who weren't Jewish and had very, very different relationships to what circumcision means to them. And it made me actually have to think about, like, what does this mean to me? But fundamentally, it's so ingrained, and I felt like it was something that was important and an important marker. But then at the same time, you brought up a really important point before, Ellie, about inclusion. And I think it's the same with interfaith. It's the same with LGBTQ+. It's the same with a lot of different people in our community who may not want to attend events or may not want to be part of the community if they don't feel welcome. So it really is a difficult situation to unravel.
I mean, from my perspective, there's also an asymmetry at the core here, which is if you make this decision for your child to circumcise them, then there's no choice later on, right? So there's an asymmetry in the choice that you're making. Whereas if you leave your child intact, if they choose later on in life to circumcise themselves because they see something beautiful in that mitzvah, they can do that. They can make that decision. So there's this fundamental asymmetry built into it.
But the asymmetry works in the other direction just
I thought
as much,
that also.
Right? It's a morning with some bagels and lox versus general anesthesia and a major, surgery.
So I know that's sort of the that's the perception out there, right? That an adult circumcision is a much bigger deal than an infant circumcision. But I've challenged that in multiple places, and I'll challenge it here too. First of all, there's a different kind of asymmetry that's going on than the one that I was just talking about, which is when you're an adult, you can psychologically prepare yourself for a surgery. You can get the kinds of analgesia that you were just referring to. You can get general anesthetic. When you're an infant, you get none of that. Not only can you not prepare yourself psychologically for something that is a very painful and traumatic early experience, but we, as people who want to make it an easier procedure, right? Like if we're thinking about good people who want to minimize the pain to the baby, the tools at our disposal are much less than when we're talking about an adult. So I just want to push back a little bit on the notion that it's a bigger deal when you're an adult. Jewish
day school is a traumatic experience that lasts for like a decade plus, and yet we impose that on our children. Right? There's a lot of things that we impose on our next generation about our faith, right, that they don't have a choice about, that they're free to walk away from.
That might be an argument against Jewish day school, not an argument for circumcision.
Pulling on strings here a little bit.
Well, I'm just curious too. It's like there are decisions that parents have to make, and we just don't know the ramifications that they will make on the baby in life, whether
in either
it's
direction.
A vaginal birth or a cesarean, in either direction too. I mean, sometimes the parents just have to make these decisions early on, and let's see what happens in the future.
Right, but this isn't one of those decisions is kind of what I would say to that, right? I don't see, and I can't think of any other body modification that would fall under the category of it has to be made when the child is 8 days old, as opposed to leaving it up to them to make a decision when they get to an age where they can make a decision. So it's true that there are certain kinds of decisions that have to be made, that, there's a moral and an ethical case that they have to be made at a certain age. I just don't see why this has to be one of them.
Yeah, I mean, again, we've disagreed about this. I'm still friends with him. This is what we refer to as a mechloket l'shem shamayim, as an argument for the sake of heaven. I think that there's oftentimes body modifications that we do. We pierce our children's ears at very early ages often. And again, you've gone through these arguments back and forth. I think it's time to get beyond that. But I think that at its core, what it comes down to is that people believe that we have the right to do something religious on our future generation, on our children, that is our prerogative to do. And if it comes down to a question of whether it's violent and harmful or not. And there are people that do see that, and that's where Bruchim is coming in. And and then there are people that don't, and I think a lot of people don't. I know anecdote. I mean, you're in a different situation where people are coming to you anecdotally and telling you things because you're the maker of cut, and I'm a rabbi, and I know anecdotally from rabbis that very few of them actually have people come to them with these discussions about what will happen if my son is not circumcised. But again, that's where things are. What I'd like to really just wrap up with and think about is. What happens in your mind? Like, what are the arguments for circumcision? Like, why do you are we at the point where you think that it's something that only adults should be making? Is there a value in circumcision in general, but only not for children? And again, Bruchim is not about this. It's about fostering these spaces, I understand. But clearly, like we said, the step back is to recognize that that's where it's at. What do you think is the role of Brit Milah in the 21st century?
So, personally, and I've said this many times, and my position on this hasn't really changed much over time. I'm not against Brit Milah, qua Brit Milah. My issue is infant circumcision. If a person grows up and decides that they want to perform this mitzvah on themselves, more power to them. And I would actually argue that there's an advantage to doing it as an adult from a religious perspective, because you can actually apprehend and appreciate the mitzvah versus when you're an infant and you're just not aware of what's happening to you. So for me, that's just sort of an obvious ethical line. I don't see a lot of downsides to it, but I think circumcision is still a very taboo subject, not only in the Jewish community, but for sure in the Jewish community too. And the problem with taboo subjects is that they kind of breed all kinds of traumas and difficult psychological suppressions and unhealthy conversations. And part of the work that I've been trying to do around this issue is to raise what is clearly a taboo subject out of the taboo and into a place where we can have constructive, intelligent, high-level, emotionally intelligent conversations about it. And I think we desperately need that in the Jewish community. I think we need to stop suppressing these conversations. We need to have them in healthy contexts, and we need to stop shaming the people who make these decisions.
Thank you, Ellie. This has been wonderful. Like I said, we may disagree about some of these points, but it's the fact of raising questions. And I actually had people tell me, don't do these types of interviews. Don't do this interview specifically. Don't give people like this a platform. It's not right. And I'm like, I can fundamentally disagree. I actually think that the court of public opinion is where these disagreements can and should be made. I may personally like you. I may personally think that your organization may not succeed at the same level. And I think that the court of public opinion is where it's going to be fought. And maybe in 5 years, you're going to come back and say, well, you know what, we tried this. And it turned out that it was a lot fewer people that were actually interested in this, and a lot fewer congregations. And we're still here, but we're really, didn't make the dent that we thought that we would, because people are still attached to it. And maybe I'll be wrong. And it'll be like, intermarriage, where interfaith relationships have become much more accepted. But it's not for you and me to make those end up decisions. It's for you and me to preach our differing opinions and everybody else too, and for public opinion to let it happen. And so that's why I think these discussions are important. There are no bad questions, like you just mentioned. There are no hard conversations that should be swept under the rug. They should all be left out in the open and brought out to the wonderful antiseptic of sunlight. And so I'd like to thank you for being here for that.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
You can find links to Bruchim and to Ellie's work in the show notes. You can email us at bonjour@thecjn.ca to let us know what you thought. We'd love to hear your comments and your questions, and I'm sure Ellie would love to hear some of them as well. We'll pass them along, and we'll maybe see what people have to say about this.
Our word of wisdom comes from my rabbi, Rabbi Mark Glickman of Temple B'nai Tikva in Calgary, Alberta.
So there's a story that is told about a guy named Melvin who for years and years prayed to God to win the lottery. God, please let me win the lottery. For years and years he prayed. And one day, after years of such prayers, he said to God, God, I've been praying for all this time to win the lottery, and you haven't helped me. What's going on here? And a booming voice came down from on high and said, Melvin, meet me halfway. At least buy a ticket. Well, I thought of that this week in studying this week's Torah portion, because this week's Torah portion is Vayetze. And we read the story of Jacob, who had fled Esau, his brother, and is out in the wilderness, and he comes across a certain place, and he lays down, he puts his head on a rock, and he has a dream in which he sees a ladder extending to heaven. There are angels going up and down on it. He has this transformative experience in which he receives the covenant from God, and he wakes up and says, surely God was in this place, and I did not know it. It's a fascinating story, and for years there was something that niggled me about that story, and that is, of all of the things for Jacob to use as a pillow, why would he use a rock? Anybody who's ever been camping knows that you don't use a rock as a pillow. You use a stuffed, smelly t-shirt or something. You use something that's softer and more comfortable. And as I reflected on it, I realized that Jacob out there in the wilderness, maybe one of the reasons he used the rock to rest his head upon is that when you lay down with the back of your head on a rock, you tend not to want to lay on your side or on your stomach. You tend to want to have the back of your head down on that rock so that you are looking up to the heavens. It seems to me that maybe one of the reasons God revealed the divine self to Jacob laying out there in the wilderness on that night is that Jacob was open to it. Jacob slept in such a way so that he looked up into the heavens. We often hope that something about our religion, something about Judaism is going to take us away, that we're just going to say, oh God, I'm here, and somehow the magic's going to happen and we're going to be swept away. But usually that's not how it works. Usually we need to direct our sights and our souls upward first, and only then will God be there to meet us. It's as if God is saying to each of us, just like we were Jacob, Jacob, meet me halfway. At least look to the heavens. So my hope for each of you this week is that you and the rest of us can look to the heavens and come away from that moment saying, surely God was in this place and I didn't know it. Surely this is Beit El, the house of God, a place where heaven and earth touch. Shabbat Shalom.
And now it's time in the show where we talk about our nachas, that little thing that made us feel good about the week, something newish, Jewish, something Canadian. Alana, what's your nachas this week?
So on November 8th, Canada Post just issued their new Hanukkah stamp, and I didn't know that those existed. The stamp comes in a self-adhesive booklet of 10, and it has a white menorah holding 9 different candles all around it. I think that's a really cool little marker. If you have to send any mail out during the Hanukkah season, it does beg the bigger dilemma that we discussed last week, which I would still love to go into at some point about why we're highlighting Hanukkah over other holidays. But at the same time, I think it's kind of fun.
I remember hearing about the Canada Post stamps, I think it was 4 years ago when they put out a stamp packet, and on the front of the stamp there was a Magen David, but they made it yellow, and some people made this huge issue out of making the Magen David yellow and made them recall those stamps. Those stamps are valuable on eBay now or something.
Oh, boy.
I don't know. Does that mean we're never allowed to have yellow Magen Davids anymore? Maybe, whatever. That's a totally different discussion, but I remember that being in my radar. I didn't know that they did it every year. Cool.
Yeah, so cool.
It's the second most Jewish Canada Post stamp that I've heard of, behind Leonard Cohen, of course.
Yes, that was a good one.
He's our specter on this show. David, what's your nachas this week?
My nachas for this week goes to Frank Herbert. As many of our listeners know, Mr. Herbert wrote Dune, which is now right in theaters. And I went this week, sort of piqued my interest with all the Muslim and Jewish references, and I did a little digging. I read the synopsis of all his books, and in the 4th installation of Dune Chapter House, our listeners will be happy to know The Jews are still kicking around after 15,000 years. It is the only religion from old Earth that survived intact throughout the millennia, so I'm going to give mad props to Frank for keeping us alive, even if we are forced to go underground.
That is quite the spicy nachas.
How about you, Abby?
I want to talk about this really old movie that everybody may have heard of or may not have necessarily seen, but The Golem. The Golem was one of the first early silent films. And Reboot, which is an organization devoted to rebooting and doing cool new things with Jewish culture, has commissioned a rescoring of The Golem with various segments and all sorts of episodes talking about The Golem itself. You should absolutely check it out. It's really interesting. It's a full digital series called The Golem Rescored on Reboot's website, rebooting.com. I found it fascinating. I'm not a big fan of these, let's just dive in and watch. I have a hard time. I understand when I see a 100-year-old film, the importance and value of it. I just don't have enough desire to watch the entire thing. I don't know if you guys have the same equivalence. You can watch a 100-year-old film.
It's great.
From beginning to end. I don't know. It's not.
I love old cinema.
But when they have a chance, an opportunity to do something interesting
I'll watch
with it,
on my own, I guess.
There you go. You're disinvited to the film club, the BCFC. So that's my nachas, and that's about it for us. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week of Parashat Vayetze, for the week of November 12th. Our producer is Michael Freeman. Technical production is by Andre Goulet. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our new page at thecjn.ca/bonjour. You can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all your episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do leave us a comment and a rating on the platform of your choice. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca. I'm Avi Feingold.
I'm Ilana Zakon.
And I'm David Sklar.
The Limud Toronto Festival takes place on Sunday, November 21st. Limud features educators, performers, authors, activists, and innovators from around the world. The Limud Festival of Jewish Learning celebrates creativity, diversity, inclusivity, and discussion. Everyone is welcome. All tickets to Limud are pay what you can. Learn more at limud.ca.